Welcome to The Nation. I'm Jessie CHAHAL. Our conversation today goes beyond politics and beyond the ballot box. For a closer look at how Malaysia continues to strengthen and refine its democratic system, we're joined today by Zoe RANDHAWA, Commissioner of the Election Commission of Malaysia. Welcome, Zoe. It's good to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, the chat about the elections is something that is on everyone's lips and minds as we gain closer or come closer towards elections within the country and particularly in some states as well. First, let's begin with the issue of trust and transparency. The EC is often accused of perhaps being biased or aligned one way or the other. How do you respond to that perception, and what does it mean for the EC to remain neutral from your point of view, from your side of the table?
First of all, I think correcting the misperception comes through raising awareness about the EC's functions that we have under the Constitution. So we have three functions, which is maintaining the electoral roll, reviewing electoral boundaries, and the conduct of elections. And often this means that people think that we have complete authority over everything that has to do with elections, and that's not the case. For example, in maintaining the electoral roll, the National Registration Department has the authority to say if someone's a citizen or not, to say if someone has passed away or not. So we are very reliant on the data from National Registration Department. For conduct of elections, in the enforcement of election offences like corrupt practices, the Election Commission has enforcement teams, but we have very, very limited powers with those enforcement teams. So we're reliant on the investigations and prosecutions by the MACC, by the police, by Attorney General's chambers. So when people accuse the EC of acting with bias, it's often because they don't understand that we don't necessarily have the authority to act all the time. And we can collaborate with other agencies to improve the electoral integrity in our elections. And also from the EC side, we can build public trust by being open to constructive criticism. We can have better dialogue with our stakeholders, politicians from all sides of the divide, and especially voters, so that when we do make decisions, then all of our stakeholders can see that we've taken their views into account and the decision we've come to is really in the best interest of voters, not any partisan interest.
If you look at the entire ecosystem, then what exactly is in the control of the EC?
So, for instance, conducting the elections, we have our regulations that the EC can formulate, but those have to be tabled in Parliament by the Cabinet. So once those regulations are set, we have complete control to implement those regulations. So I'll give an example of a reform like Undi 18 and automatic voter registration. Once that was passed through Parliament, basically it came to the Election Commission to decide exactly how we want to amend the regulations to implement it, exactly how we want to add voters to the electoral roll. So when we were going through that process, we made improvements that we saw the opportunity to make with this constitutional amendment, like faster and more efficient voter registration.
So you've been with the EC since, for a couple of years now, in fact, and what sort of change or improvement in terms of processes, and we talked a little bit about gradual change, what have you seen in the past few years?
I think for me, one of the most important things has been improvements in transparency and openness of the EC, really engaging with stakeholders, having dialogue sessions with them, really engaging with political parties, NGOs, so they don't feel like you never listen to what they have to say. They're brought to the table and we really value that feedback. So in terms of stakeholder engagement, transparency with our processes and information, that's been key. But also in terms of the actual electoral process, I think if you speak to overseas voters, for example, now, compared to their experiences in the past, they are far more satisfied with our service delivery. It doesn't mean that there aren't big steps to take, but we have made big strides in improving overseas voter ballot delivery, for example.
I'll take you back when there was this, of course, debate and then brought into terms of a process or improvement of process or change of process for the ink, and that came after some pressure from the public. What were some internal debates that were going on or challenges that, in fact, delayed its introduction, and what lessons has the EC sort of learned from that moving forward to ensure that this delays of such doesn't happen?
Yeah, so the ink was brought in 2013 during the 13th general election, and it was in response to the Parliamentary Special Select Committee on Electoral Reform in 2011. And it was a major reform because not only did it bring more security to the electoral process, but it built a lot of public trust in one move, because it's a very visible sign for people to see that you can only vote once in our elections. But that process took time because the EC then, they needed to amend regulations like we had to do with Undi 18. We had to go through a long-winded process of amending regulations. They had to consult with agencies and other stakeholders. Also with the ink, they needed to make sure that it was logistically feasible. So they need to be able to supply very large amounts of ink at a very short notice if there's a snap election. So all of these considerations need to be made before the ink could have been brought in. And what it shows, I think, is that the public can be wanting electoral reform to happen as soon as possible, and sometimes I also want electoral reform to happen as soon as possible, but it's the EC's responsibility that any reforms we make are feasible in line with the current law and also don't jeopardize any other part of the election process.
Now that I have you here in the hot seat, when you say that you also sometimes are excited or interested to see some structural change, what could that be from this point forward? Maybe a couple of examples.
Some major structural changes I would like to see. I hope we're going to discuss about the idea of residential voting. And I think one of the major problems we have with our electoral system is at the moment, voters are given a choice whether to update their voting address or not. And that means that, for example, apartment blocks in KL that were demolished decades ago can still have voters registered there. And the EC has no power to update their address, and it causes a whole sort of flow-on effect of how MPs are elected and how they serve their local community and represent their local community. So I think a big structural reform that I really would like to see is this power to update people's voting addresses by the EC and in line with their IC addresses.
The other thing I could only presume that could be a challenge for the EC, especially in the time of social media, is this narratives or this, waterfall of misinformation and disinformation. Of course, that can damage public trust before or ahead of a polling day. What steps does the EC take to ensure that at least there's some preventive measures?
Yeah, so misinformation and disinformation is a real threat to election integrity and election processes. And it's not just in Malaysia. Election commissions all around the world are struggling with this trend. And we try to learn from other commissions, and other commissions around the world are taking good actions to combat this, but we also try to adapt it to our local context. So we have three prongs of a strategy. The first one is to try to be as proactively open as possible with our processes and information. So that means that voters and the public already have a general knowledge buffer against misinformation and disinformation. They can, for example, our voter education portal by Election Academy, it's got this wealth of information on how we train our election workers. It's got all the slides, the videos, even the workbooks they use on election day. So anyone can go and see and understand the full depth of our election processes. And if they have that general knowledge buffer, when they encounter misinformation and disinformation, they can already see that it's false themselves without even having to digest it. And then because we have that process of trying to be proactive in our sharing of information, we have a strategy of stop, check, verify. So really stop, look at the information you have, check it with us because we have the information there that you can check it with, and verify it before you share it. So we're really trying to push voters to basically, you're the guardians of stopping misinformation and disinformation if you check first.
We're seeing that image on screen as well, to stop, check and verify. And I think that's a golden rule that applies across the board, election time or not, when dealing with misinformation and premature narratives. As we move on, some say credibility isn't just about process, but it must involve some amount of empathy as well. People want to feel that the EC is there, that the EC is listening and of course taking note and hopefully taking action. How does the Commission try to bridge this emotional gap with the voters? We did talk a little bit earlier where we said, or rather I weighed in by saying the EC perhaps in the past 5-10 years wasn't as visible or vocal as it seems to be now.
Yeah, I think the first thing is that it's not just the members of the Commission that need to be visible. The majority of the experiences voters have with the Election Commission is on polling day itself and their experience voting. So exceptional frontline public service delivery that shows that we care about voters is really the first step. So with the way we recruit and we train our election workers, from returning officers to the ushers at the front of a polling station, treating voters with compassion and showing that we take pride in helping them vote is really what sets the initial standard and expectation of the public towards the EC. But then when it comes to not on polling day, when people don't necessarily see us right in front of their eyes, what we try to do is make sure we are engaging as often and regularly as possible with all of our stakeholders. And we have taken concrete steps towards this. For example, we have town hall meetings with voters and the public, and we have online Q&A sessions now where anyone can ask questions on the topics highlighted. We have more dialogue sessions with politicians and political parties and NGOs, so they feel like we're listening to them more and we take their feedback into account when making policy. We also have civic education programs to really make sure that voters understand that participating in elections isn't just a duty, but really it's this shared national experience. So they have this this link between voting and this emotional tie to the voting experience and being a voter. So it's quite an emotive thing to exercise your democratic right.
Mm-hmm. And ahead of that, and going back to what you pointed out earlier as well, residential voting, why is it that voters must still return to their home addresses that's on their IC or what is within the system to cast their ballots? Is there any changes or barriers that's preventing this from changing?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because it's a question we get asked a lot, and I think a lot of people expect the EC to facilitate this sort of voting. But what's in our constitution is that we give voters a choice. Either they can vote where they currently live, residential voting, which is normally the basis of a first-past-the-post system, or they can choose not to update their voting address to where they currently live, and that means that they have to go back to where they used to live, where they were first registered to vote, in order to vote, often their hometowns. So if voters have made this choice, it means in general they have to bear the cost of that choice to go back to their hometown. And in the first-past-the-post system, most countries in the world do not allow voters that choice. They enforce you vote where you live because that's really the basis of a residential voting system like first past the post.
Right. So do we see that sort of underway?
We are running a campaign at the moment to try to encourage voters to update their voting address, and we've made it as easy as we possibly can. So once you've changed your address with the National Registration Department, you can open an account with SPR, so you can securely apply to change your voting address online. And once you have a My SPR account, it takes all of 2 minutes to fill out the form, and then your voting address will be updated within a month. It used to be quite a long-winded process, and it would take up to 6 months to change your voting address. Now, if you're out of your home constituency for 2 months already, you should already be updating your voting address, and then if you go back and live in your hometown in the future, then you can always update your voting address again then.
I must presume as well many people could be guilty of not doing that, and perhaps a point to note as well to do it early on and not when the elections are around the corner.
Exactly, that is a really good point, because once an election has been called, once Parliament has been dissolved or your state legislative assembly has been dissolved, we can't update the electoral roll anymore. So if you wait till after dissolution, then we can't update your address because that's in the law. We can't make any changes to the electoral roll after dissolution. So then that's what happens normally. People suddenly realize once an election is called, they want to update their voting address, but we can't do anything for them in that election. So really, especially open your My SPR account now, and then the process of any sort of service that SPR can provide to you is done within minutes.
Take this as a reminder from the Commissioner herself. Now, many Malaysians overseas say they still struggle to get their postal votes home on time. Are there any improvements or innovations that can make this process a lot more seamless, faster and smoother?
Yeah, this is something that the Commission is really aware of, and we recognise that at the moment it's still very much a challenge for overseas voters, and we really are trying our best to improve the processes, and we have done some major improvements. For example, they can now apply for a postal vote through their MySPR account. So if you have a MySPR account, it's easy to apply for a postal vote securely. We also have much better information sharing through Ministry of Foreign Affairs, through the media, through NGOs, and also we have a 24-hour call centre for overseas voters to call during the election period with any questions. But the biggest improvement I think we've made is in terms of efficiency for ballot printing, issuance and delivery, because the problem we have is time constraints. So we have a 60-day time period to finish an election, and within that normally we have a 14-day campaign period, which means it's very, very tight for voters to send out and return their ballots in time. What we are looking at is extending the campaign period to between 19 to 21 days to give them more time to send their ballots back in time for polling day. Alternatively, we're looking at the Canadian method of postal voting, where there is a blank ballot without the candidate details on them that we can print and prepare and send out before nomination day. And then after nomination day, the voters can fill out the ballot and send it back. So they have the full 14 days or the full campaign period to send their ballot back. So it gives them significantly more time. However, these two ideas are still very much in the planning stages. We've had some engagement sessions with political parties, and rest assured that any changes we do make, we're not going to risk jeopardizing the safety and security of our ballot integrity or the voting process as a whole.
Yeah. Still on that note though, and closer to home, in East Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawakians who work in the peninsula or in West Malaysia, they need to fly back to vote, and every time it's voting season, this becomes a discussion point or a pain point. Can't there be at this moment in time a cross-state voting option, given that we were once, all sort of one state, one federation?
Yeah, this very much comes back to the previous discussion about residential voting and the idea of making sure you vote where you live. So it's not based on where you were born or where you're from. The electoral system we have, and in Article 119 of the Constitution, it's about residency. So when you're registered to vote as a voter, the constituency is determined by your residential address. It's not determined by whether you're Sabahan or Sarawakian or from Kelantan or Johor. If you live in KL, for example, you're registered as a voter in KL. So what happens is if we start allowing voters from Sabah and Sarawak to vote in Peninsular Malaysia when they don't live there, it ends up reducing and diluting the effects of this residential first-past-the-post system, which is the core of our elections.
Right. So what about countries like in Indonesia, where they've managed to let their citizens vote at embassies or large venues like the PWTC? Can Malaysia learn from some of those examples or models? And what would be the real constraints then?
I think the real constraint adopting the Indonesian system is Indonesia has a very different electoral system to Malaysia. So it has a presidential system and it has a proportional representation system for their national parliament. So when KPU, the Election Commission of Indonesia, was studying overseas voters for them, they decided it was too complex logistically to have voting for their local and regional elections. And they limit overseas voters to the presidential election, and all overseas voters vote in one district in Jakarta. So that means that the ballot paper for Indonesian overseas voters is the same for all voters. It means it's much more logistically simple for the Election Commission there to carry out overseas voters in one location. For us, our system is constituency based, and we have over 600 constituencies if you look at the state level as well. That means 600 different ballot papers and 600 different ballot boxes that we would have to have in these overseas voting centres, which is just far too logistically complicated to actually carry out. And that's what KPU also found in Indonesia for local and regional votes. And also, the feedback we've received from overseas voters, for example, is they would prefer to receive a postal ballot rather than have to travel, say, long distances from Texas to Washington, D.C. in order to cast their votes in these mega voting centres. So getting your ballot sent directly to your doorstep is actually, we found, for the Malaysian context, a better alternative.
Well, if you had full control in terms of resources and whatnot, policy, what would be the first change you made? You already mentioned earlier about the residential voting as one of the areas you'd like to see some processes be made simpler. But overall, to make the voting simpler for those who are within the country and overseas as well, and not just simpler, but fairer and more inclusive.
Yeah, I think like you said, the residential voting system is the big ticket item for me at the moment, and overseas voting as well. But for me personally as well, I struggle to see voters that are bedridden, for example, having to go in an ambulance and being wheeled out of the ambulance to the polling station. I feel like the EC, if we have all the resources available to us, we can do better for people with disabilities, for people in permanent care homes, even pregnant women. You know, when I was pregnant and having to go out to vote, it's not easy.
I remember that as well,
Yeah.
queuing up, and they had an
Exactly.
express lane,
Yes.
so that made it
We make it a lot
easier.
easier, but I think that we can still make it more accessible. I think it's a good way to improve voter turnout, and it's a good way to build that emotional connection with voters to show that we really care.
Well, we look at the independence and the future of the EC. Of course, how does the EC aim to maintain its independence in terms when leaders and you know, climates change in terms of politics and national leaders and so on? In fact, if that keeps changing, does that affect the EC?
I think the independence of the Election Commission is really strongly grounded in the foundations of law. So we have the Federal Constitution, we have the Elections Act, we have the Election Commissions Act, and all of this legal framework sort of shields the Election Commission from external influence. The Federal Constitution guarantees commissioners security of tenure, so we can't be removed from office if there are changes in the political scene. The laws require that we have a responsibility for our officers to behave impartially and in accordance with the law, and it's actually an offence for anyone to try to influence a member of the Election Commission. So I think when the members of the Election Commission are appointed, we bear this responsibility of public confidence, and we take that very seriously. So that with this entire legal framework of protection around us, it means that this changing of political, landscape really doesn't affect the internal decision-making of the Election Commission at all.
And so how do initiatives like the automatic voters and the Undi 18, how does that reflect whether or not the EC has been able to take a genuine step forward in terms of independence and not being partial or biased or influenced by these external factors?
So I said that the Election Commission isn't impacted in our decision-making by the external political currents. But what is impacted sometimes is the current towards electoral reform. So if there is political will, say, to make constitutional changes for Undi 18 or automatic voter registration, or in the case of residential voting, enforcing residential voting. If there's political will towards these reforms, then it gives the Election Commission the opportunity to then go about and implement them autonomously and independently. So yes, we are completely independent, but reform is dependent on certain legislative changes as well.
We talked a little bit about inclusiveness and making the entire voting system more accessible for voters. How can the EC strengthen, besides the wealth of information that's available on the websites and on other social media platforms, how can the EC strengthen Malaysians' understanding when to ensure that it really serves the people and it really bridges that gap in creating the awareness and education for the people? So away from politics, more on the people.
I think a shift in understanding among all Malaysians is actually needed, from this idea that the Election Commission alone needs to safeguard our elections, and we're the sole guardians of everything to do with democracy and upholding our election integrity. Instead, I want to encourage this idea of a shared national mission for upholding our democracy and our elections. So if you're a member of the public and you see an election offence, please report it to the MACC or to the police. If you feel strongly about an issue within elections, you can become an election observer with one of the accredited NGOs we have. You can become a polling agent or counting agent with a political party or a candidate. Or if you just want to make a complaint or a recommendation to the EC, we have open feedback channels at all times to try to encourage voters to really put it upon themselves as well, to really take ownership of an independent election commission and a fair and free election and democratic process.
That's of course what we're all hoping and gaining for. But looking ahead, besides some of the examples you've highlighted in terms of transparency to technology, what sort of innovations would you like to see that could really help future-proof Malaysia's electoral system?
I think the EC has already done quite a lot in terms of introducing technology where it is needed to election processes. For example, having this digital service of being able to update your voting address and apply for a postal vote, to lodge objections online. All of these, this use of technology makes it much easier for voters to carry out any applications with the Election Commission. We also have better information sharing from the polling station to our centralised offices during polling day. So things like voter turnout statistics, now it's done in a very timely manner. It's much more accurate than it used to be because we've improved our technology in reporting even election incidents on polling day itself. When it comes to further use of technology, I think we have to be quite careful about not having modernization just for modernization's sake and not using technology just for technology's sake. When there's a problem, for example, that technology can fulfill, we also have to be really careful of the risks of technology, its security, public trust in that technology, and also more logistically, the long-term costs that technology could bring about. So we can't just simply use technology and it could undermine the democratic process rather than strengthen it.
So RANDHAWA, thank you for stepping in and for highlighting some of not just the issues but the progress that EC has made. We acknowledge and of course appreciate the Election Commission of Malaysia for its ongoing efforts to ensure transparency, fairness and inclusivity in our democratic process. And strengthening democracy is not just about one election, it's about empowering every voter, you and I, building trust in our institutions and ensuring that the voices of all Malaysians are heard. I'm JESSY CHAHAL. This has been The Nation. Thanks for watching and do follow us for more in-depth conversations on issues that truly matter. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.